14,411 feet. That is the height of Mount Rainier, the highest point in the Cascade Range, the most heavily glaciated peak in the contiguous United States, a mountain so massive that it generates its own weather systems, so dominant that it fills the entire horizon from 100 miles away, so familiar that millions of people see it every day from their kitchen windows, their office buildings, their morning commutes through Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia. 600 feet. That is the vertical distance between a group of climbers and the summit they had trained for, paid for, and dreamed of reaching. 600 feet. In good conditions, perhaps 90 minutes of climbing, close enough to see, close enough to taste. 2. That is the number of people who would never descend the mountain. 2 lives, 2 families shattered, 2 bodies left on the ice because a storm arrived faster than anyone predicted, lasted longer than anyone prepared for, and cared nothing for the plans, the permits, the professional guides, or the modern equipment that was supposed to make this climb safe. 14,411 feet of aspiration. 600 feet of proximity. 2 lives lost in the space between. June 11, 1996. Mount Rainier National Park, Washington State, the Pacific Northwest of the United States. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, while most of America slept, a rope team of climbers departed from Camp Sherman, a small ranger station and camping area perched at 9,500 feet on a rocky ridge between 2 massive glaciers. They moved in darkness, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through the cold alpine air, their crampons biting into snow that had frozen solid overnight. The temperature hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The stars were visible, though perhaps slightly hazed. The mountain loomed above them, invisible in the darkness except as an absence of stars, a vast black shape blocking out the sky. They were clients of Alpine Ascents International, one of the premier guiding companies in American mountaineering. They had paid approximately $700 each for the privilege of this attempt. They had trained for months. They had practiced crampon technique and ice axe arrest and rope team travel. They had learned the basics of crevasse rescue. They had listened to their guides explain the dangers of the Emmons Glacier route, the crevasses, the altitude, the weather. And they had signed waivers acknowledging that mountaineering is inherently dangerous, that people die on mountains, that no guide can guarantee safety. They understood all of this in the abstract. By nightfall, they would understand it in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The summit of Mount Rainier on a clear day offers one of the most spectacular views in North America. You can see the Olympic Mountains to the west, the Cascade volcanoes stretching north and south, Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and on exceptional days, the Pacific Ocean glimmering beyond the Olympic range. The summit crater contains fumaroles that vent warm steam from the volcano's still active interior, creating ice caves that glow blue and crystalline in the sunlight. None of the climbers who departed Camp Sherman that morning would ever see the summit. And for 2 of them, the sunrise they witnessed as they ascended above 12,000 feet would be the last sunrise they would ever see. What no one at Camp Sherman realized, not the clients, not the guides, not the National Park Service rangers monitoring conditions from below, is that the outcome of June 11th would not be decided by any single dramatic event. It would not be decided by an avalanche. It would not be decided by a crevasse fall. It would not be decided by equipment failure or human error in any obvious sense. It would be decided by something far more insidious. A gap between the weather forecasting technology available in 1996 and the atmospheric reality of Mount Rainier, a volcano so massive that it creates its own microclimate, generating storms that materialize faster than any regional forecast can predict. A gap between the commercial mountaineering industry's need for predictability, fixed schedules, weather windows, summit success rates that attract paying clients, and the fundamental unpredictability of a 14,000-foot peak exposed to Pacific weather systems. A gap between the emergency bivouac equipment the climbers carried, designed for a few hours of unexpected delay, and the 40-plus hours of survival that the mountain would ultimately demand. A gap between the mountain people thought they were climbing, familiar, well-traveled, professionally guided, regulated by the National Park Service, and the mountain that actually existed above 13,000 feet when the atmosphere turned hostile. These gaps would prove fatal. Not because anyone was reckless, not because the guides were incompetent, not because the clients were unprepared, but because the system itself, the entire architecture of commercial mountaineering on America's most iconic peak, had been optimized for the mountain's average behavior, not its worst behavior. And on June 11, 1996, Mount Rainier delivered its worst. This is not the story of a freak accident. This is not the story of climbers who got unlucky with the weather. This is the story of how ordinary people, people like you, people who trusted professionals and followed the rules and did everything they were supposed to do, walked into a system that was designed to work 95% of the time and catastrophically failed in the remaining 5%. It is the story of decisions that seemed reasonable when they were made and proved fatal in retrospect. It is the story of a mountain that millions of people see every day from their homes and offices, a mountain that looks tame, accessible, almost friendly from a distance, and the alien, lethal environment that same mountain becomes when you are trapped above 13,000 feet in a whiteout blizzard with inadequate gear and no way down. And it is the story of what happens when we place our trust in systems, guides, forecasts, protocols, equipment that cannot fully comprehend the forces we are asking them to manage. By minute 45, you will understand why the weather forecasting available in 1996 could not adequately predict what Mount Rainier was about to do, and why the guides who made the decision to climb were not reckless, but were operating in a domain where reasonable decisions can still be fatal. By minute 90, you will be inside the snow cave at 13,800 feet, listening to the wind that sounded like a freight train, watching Patrick Nestler's condition deteriorate hour by hour, and understanding why the party could not descend even though safety lay less than 5 miles away. And by the end, you will know the answer to the question that haunts every guided mountaineering expedition. When we pay someone to lead us into a wilderness that does not negotiate, whose judgment do we trust? And what happens when that trust encounters a force that no human judgment can fully comprehend? But first, you need to understand the world that made this disaster possible. You need to understand what Mount Rainier is, not the postcard image, not the logo on the license plate, but the actual geological and atmospheric reality of the most dangerous volcano in North America. And you need to understand what commercial mountaineering had become by 1996, the pressures, the economics, the expectations, and why a guide standing at 13,000 feet with a developing lenticular cloud above him might look at the sky and see ambiguity rather than certainty. Let's begin with the mountain. Mount Rainier is not merely a mountain. It is a volcano. An active stratovolcano, in fact, one of 16 volcanoes that the United States Geological Survey has designated as posing the greatest threat to human life and infrastructure in the nation. It last erupted approximately 1,000 years ago, and it will erupt again. The question is not if but when. But the volcanic threat is not what killed Patrick Nestler and John Craver in June of 1996. What killed them was something that flows directly from Rainier's volcanic nature, its size, its glaciers, and its weather. Mount Rainier rises 14,411 feet above sea level. But more importantly, It rises approximately 9,000 feet above its surrounding terrain in a single, massive, isolated cone. This isolation is critical. Most mountain ranges, the Alps, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, consist of multiple peaks clustered together, sharing the burden of disrupting atmospheric flow. Rainier stands alone. It is the only major obstacle to weather systems moving inland from the Pacific Ocean for hundreds of miles in any direction. When moist Pacific air encounters Mount Rainier, it has nowhere to go but up. The air rises rapidly along the mountain's flanks, cooling as it ascends. Moisture condenses, clouds form, precipitation falls. The mountain receives an average of 640 inches of snow per year at the Paradise Ranger Station on its southern slope, among the highest snowfall totals ever recorded on Earth. But the snowfall statistics, impressive as they are, do not capture what makes Rainier truly dangerous. What makes Rainier dangerous is its capacity for rapid storm generation. Because Rainier stands alone, and because it rises so dramatically above its surroundings, it creates its own localized weather systems that can develop faster than regional forecasts can predict. The most important of these phenomena is the lenticular cloud. Lenticular clouds are lens-shaped formations that develop when stable, moist air flows over a mountain peak. They appear to hover motionless over the summit, often stacked in layers like a pile of dinner plates. To casual observers, they are beautiful, dramatic, sculptural, otherworldly. To mountaineers, they are warning signs. A lenticular cloud over Rainier indicates that moisture is present at high altitude and that atmospheric conditions are unstable. It does not guarantee a storm. Many lenticular formations develop and dissipate without producing significant weather at climbing altitude. But when a lenticular system does produce a storm, it can do so with terrifying speed. Conditions at 14,000 feet can transition from clear skies to total whiteout in less than an hour. And a whiteout on Mount Rainier is not merely inconvenient. It is potentially fatal. This is because of the glaciers. Mount Rainier carries more glacial ice than all other peaks in the contiguous United States combined. 25 named glaciers flow from its summit, covering approximately 35 square miles. The Emmons Glacier, on the mountain's northeast face, is the largest glacier by surface area in the lower 48 states. These glaciers are riddled with crevasses, deep cracks in the ice that can be hundreds of feet deep and completely invisible under a layer of fresh snow. In clear weather, experienced climbers can identify crevasse zones by subtle changes in the snow surface, by the way shadows fall, by the alignment of features with the glacier's flow. Routes are marked with bamboo wands, slender poles placed every 100 feet or so to guide climbers through safe corridors between the crevasse fields. In a whiteout, all of this disappears. The wands become invisible at distances of 10 feet or less. The surface features vanish into a featureless gray-white void. The horizon dissolves. Climbers lose the ability to distinguish up from down, solid ground from open crevasse. Movement becomes suicidal. A single wrong step can mean a fall into a crack in the ice from which there may be no rescue. This is the environment the Alpine Ascents Party entered on June 11, 1996. Not a mountain that cooperates, a mountain that tolerates. And on June 11th, it stopped tolerating. The climbing party had chosen to ascend via the Emmons Glacier route. This was not a mistake in any conventional sense. The Emmons is one of Mount Rainier's classic routes, well established, well documented, attempted by hundreds of climbers every season. It is, by some measures, less technically difficult than the more popular Disappointment Cleaver route on the mountain's south side. The angle of the glacier is moderate. The route finding in good conditions is straightforward. But the Emmons route has characteristics that would prove critical on June 11th. First, it is remote. The approach to the Emmons begins at the White River campground on the mountain's northeast side, approximately 10 miles by trail from the nearest paved road. Climbers must hike through old-growth forest, ascend through alpine meadows, cross a lateral moraine, and climb a steep headwall to reach Camp Sherman at 9,500 feet. The total approach distance is approximately 8 miles, with over 5,000 feet of elevation gain. Camp Sherman itself is perched on 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏, a rocky ridge that separates the Emmons Glacier from the 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗪. During the climbing season, a National Park Service ranger is typically stationed at a small hut, monitoring conditions and providing emergency assistance. But the ranger's resources are limited. There is no road access. Rescue teams approaching from the south side of the mountain, where the park's primary facilities are located, must travel more than 15 miles and cross multiple glaciers to reach Camp Sherman. The only rapid access is by helicopter. And helicopter operations at 9,500 feet, much less at 13,000 feet, are dangerous, weather-dependent, and limited by the capabilities of the aircraft available. Second, the Emmons route is exposed. Unlike routes on the mountain's south side, which offer some protection from Pacific weather systems, the Emmons faces directly into the prevailing storm track. Weather moving inland from the ocean strikes the northeast face of Rainier with minimal warning. The upper Emmons above 12,000 feet offers no shelter whatsoever, no rock outcroppings, no ridges to block the wind, nothing but open glacier extending in every direction. When a storm catches climbers on the upper Emmons, there is nowhere to hide. They must either descend, navigating crevassed terrain that may be invisible in whiteout conditions, or dig in and wait. On June 11th, descent would prove impossible, and waiting would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. Third, and most critically, the Emmons route places climbers in a position where the decision to continue or retreat must be made at approximately 13,000 feet, deep in the most exposed section of the upper mountain, with significant crevasse terrain between them and the safety of Camp Sherman. This is the point of no return. Below this elevation, retreat in deteriorating weather is difficult but feasible. The glacier's crevasses are less concentrated, the visibility needed for safe travel is less demanding, and the distance to shelter is measured in hours rather than the full day it would take to descend from near the summit. Above this elevation, climbers commit to a course of action that requires continued weather cooperation. If the weather holds, they can summit and return before conditions deteriorate. If the weather does not hold, they become trapped in terrain where movement is dangerous and rescue is nearly impossible. On the morning of June 11th, at approximately 10 o'clock, the climbing party crossed this threshold. They continued ascending. The decision was not obviously wrong at the time, but it was the decision that sealed their fate. To understand why the party continued climbing, to understand the pressures that shaped the guide's decision, the client's expectations, and the entire system that brought them to that moment, you need to understand what commercial mountaineering on Mount Rainier had become by 1996. Mount Rainier has been a target of human ambition since the mid-19th century. The first documented summit attempt occurred in 1857, when Lieutenant August Valentine Kautz of the United States Army ascended the south side of the mountain and came within 400 feet of the summit before being forced to turn back by exhaustion and deteriorating conditions. The first confirmed summit was achieved in 1870 by Hazard Stevens and Philemon Beecher Van Trump, who spent a freezing night in the volcanic steam caves near the summit before descending the following morning. For the next century, climbing Mount Rainier remained a pursuit of dedicated mountaineers, people with extensive wilderness experience, specialized skills, the time and resources to organize independent expeditions, The mountain was climbed regularly, but in relatively small numbers, by people who understood that they were accepting significant risk. This began to change in the 1960s and 70s. The founding of Rainier Mountaineering Incorporated in 1969 marked the beginning of large-scale commercial guiding on the mountain. RMI offered multi-day guided climbs for paying clients, providing professional guides, shared equipment, and structured training to people who lacked the experience or resources to organize independent attempts. The model was successful. By the 1980s, thousands of people were attempting Mount Rainier each year, the majority of them guided clients. New guiding companies emerged: International Mountain Guides, 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗺𝗃 International, and others, competing for clients by offering different routes, different schedules, and different approaches to the climbing experience. 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗺 International was founded by 𝗪𝗶𝗽𝗍𝒄, one of the most accomplished American mountaineers of his generation. 𝗪𝗟𝗍 was the first American to summit Mount Everest via the North Face. He had climbed all 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. He built 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗺𝗺 into a premier guiding company, known for its experienced guides, its professional standards, and its commitment to client safety. The guides who worked for 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗺 were not amateurs playing at mountaineering. They were professionals. Trained, experienced, certified. They had climbed Rainier dozens or hundreds of times. They had rescued stranded climbers, treated altitude sickness and frostbite, turned back clients who were too slow or too sick to continue. They understood the mountain's dangers intimately. And yet, the commercial guiding model, for all its professionalism, created pressures that were subtle but powerful. Clients paid significant fees. By 1996, approximately $600 to $800 per person for a multi-day Rainier climb. They traveled from across the country, took time off work, trained for months. They arrived at the mountain with expectations. They wanted to reach the summit. That was the goal. That was what they had paid for. Guides understood that summit success rates mattered. Companies with higher success rates attracted more clients. Guides who consistently summited were valued. Guides who consistently turned back were questioned. This created no explicit pressure to take unacceptable risks. No professional guide would knowingly lead clients into danger for the sake of a summit. But it created a context in which ambiguous situations were resolved in favor of continuing rather than retreating. And ambiguous situations were the norm on Mount Rainier. The mountain's weather was inherently unpredictable. Lenticular clouds formed regularly and often dissipated without incident. Wind increased and decreased. Skis clouded over and cleared. A guide standing at 13,000 feet, looking at a forming lenticular cap, could not know with certainty whether that formation would produce a storm or evaporate harmlessly. The forecast, if one was even available at that altitude, could not tell him. His experience, years of climbing the mountain, dozens of successful summits, told him that most of the time, conditions like these were manageable. Most of the time. The commercial guiding model was calibrated to the mountain's average behavior. On June 11, 1996, the mountain delivered something far worse than average. And the system was not designed to survive the exception. There is a grim irony in the timing of the Mount Rainier disaster. Exactly 1 month earlier, on May 10th and 11th, 1996, a storm on Mount Everest had killed 8 climbers, including 2 of the world's most experienced high-altitude guides. The Everest disaster would become the most famous mountaineering tragedy of the 20th century, the subject of multiple books, a major motion picture, years of debate about the ethics and practices of commercial guiding on the world's highest peaks. The Everest disaster had ignited a global conversation about whether mountains like Everest, remote, extreme, unforgiving, could ever be safely commercialized. Critics argued that the commercial model created perverse incentives, encouraging guides to push forward when conditions demanded retreat, placing paying clients in positions of exposure they were not equipped to survive. Defenders argued that commercial guiding, properly managed, made high-altitude mountaineering safer by providing professional leadership, fixed routes, and emergency resources that independent climbers lacked. The debate was still raging when the storm hit Mount Rainier. The climbers who departed Camp Sherman at 2 o'clock on the morning of June 11th may or may not have been aware of what had happened on Everest a month earlier. If they were, they likely dismissed its relevance. Everest was a different world, 8,000 meters, the death zone, extreme cold, brutal winds, the highest point on Earth. Rainier was familiar. Rainier was visible from Seattle. Rainier was climbed by thousands of people every year, most of them without incident. Rainier was guided by professionals, regulated by the National Park Service, monitored by rangers stationed along the route. Rainier was safe, except when it wasn't. The lessons of Everest, that commercial systems on high mountains will eventually encounter conditions that no system can survive, that ambiguous weather signs must be read conservatively, that the gap between a successful summit day and a deadly one is measured in hours of atmospheric cooperation, were still reverberating through the mountaineering world when Rainier delivered its own eerily parallel verdict. The 1996 season was not done claiming lives. And Mount Rainier, for all its familiarity, for all its accessibility, for all its permits and protocols and professional guides, remained what it had always been. A mountain that does not negotiate. Who were the people who climbed into danger on June 11th? They were not professional mountaineers. They were not extreme athletes seeking to test the limits of human endurance. They were not thrill seekers with a death wish or adventurers fleeing conventional lives. They were ordinary people. Professionals and tradespeople, parents and spouses, people with mortgages and careers and retirement accounts. They came from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different walks of life. What united them was a shared aspiration: to stand on the summit of Mount Rainier, to look out over the Pacific Northwest from 14,000 feet, to accomplish something that most people only dream about. Patrick Nestler was 34 years old. He was physically fit, enthusiastic. He had trained specifically for this climb. He had done his homework. He understood in the abstract that mountaineering carried risks. He had signed the waiver, listened to the safety briefings, practiced the techniques. He was not a novice in the outdoors, but he was not an experienced high-altitude climber either. He was a client, someone who had paid for the expertise and leadership of professional guides. John Craver was an experienced outdoorsman. He had spent years in wilderness environments, developing the self-reliance and physical conditioning that outdoor life demands. He was determined and independent-minded, qualities that serve well in many contexts, but can become liabilities when absolute deference to group movement is required. On a rope team in a whiteout, independence can mean death. The other clients, whose names are less prominent in the historical record, many of whom survived with varying degrees of frostbite and trauma, were similar. They were people who had decided that climbing Mount Rainier was something they wanted to do, who had saved the money, taken the time off work, committed to the physical preparation required. They trusted the system. They trusted the guides. They trusted the mountain to behave the way it usually behaved. This trust was not unreasonable. Commercial guiding on Mount Rainier had an excellent safety record. The vast majority of guided clients who attempted the mountain either summited successfully or turned back without serious incident. Deaths occurred. Mountaineering is inherently dangerous, but they were rare, usually the result of objective hazards like avalanches or crevasse falls rather than systematic failures of the guiding model. The clients on the June 11th climb had every reason to believe that they would be among the majority who returned safely. They had no way of knowing that they were about to become the minority. The lead guide for the June 11th summit attempt was Sean Patrick Ryan. Ryan was not a cowboy or a risk-taker. He was a professional mountaineer with extensive experience on Mount Rainier. He had guided the peak numerous times. He had trained in high-altitude rescue. He knew the Emmons Glacier route intimately, its crevasse fields, its exposure, its particular vulnerabilities to weather. His peers respected him as competent and safety-conscious. He was the kind of guide that commercial clients were paying for, experienced, calm under pressure, able to manage the physical and psychological challenges of leading inexperienced climbers through demanding terrain. But Ryan, like all guides on Rainier in 1996, operated within constraints that he did not choose and could not escape. The first constraint was forecasting. Weather forecasting technology in 1996 was vastly inferior to what is available today. There were no smartphone apps delivering real-time satellite imagery. There were no high-resolution models capable of simulating Rainier's localized weather systems. The forecasts available to climbing parties were regional in scope, covering the Pacific Northwest broadly, and could not capture the mountain's capacity for rapid, localized storm development. When Ryan assessed conditions on the morning of June 11th, he was not ignoring a forecast that predicted disaster. There was no such forecast. The information available to him suggested a reasonable weather window. The conditions at Camp Sherman appeared acceptable. The early morning sky showed some haziness, some indication of high-altitude moisture, but nothing that definitively signaled danger. What Ryan saw was ambiguity. An ambiguity, for a guide under pressure to deliver a summit, is a space where reasonable people can disagree. The second constraint was the commercial model itself. Ryan's job was to lead paying clients to the summit of Mount Rainier. His success was measured, at least in part, by whether he accomplished that goal. He was not explicitly pressured to take unacceptable risks. No professional guiding company operates that way, but he operated in a context where turning back was a cost. It meant disappointing clients who had paid and traveled and trained. It meant explaining to the company that conditions he had judged marginal had led him to abort. It meant accepting that his judgment would be evaluated in hindsight by people who were not standing on the mountain at that moment. None of this means that Ryan made the wrong call because of commercial pressure. It means that commercial pressure was one of many factors influencing a decision that had to be made in real time, with imperfect information, in an environment where the margin for error was essentially zero. The third constraint was the nature of the decision itself. When Ryan stood at 13,000 feet on the morning of June 11th, looking up at a forming lenticular cloud over the summit, he faced a choice that was genuinely difficult. If he turned back and the storm never materialized, he would have aborted a summit attempt unnecessarily, disappointing his clients, costing his company a successful climb, and second-guessing himself afterward. If he continued and the weather held, he would lead his clients to the summit and back, adding another successful ascent to his record and theirs. If he continued and the storm materialized, as it did, he would trap his party in the most exposed terrain on the mountain with inadequate equipment and no way down. The problem is that Ryan could not know, at the moment of decision, which of these outcomes would unfold. The lenticular cloud was forming, but lenticular clouds formed regularly on Rainier and often dissipated without incident. The wind was increasing, but wind increased and decreased throughout every climbing day. Conditions were worsening, but they were not yet at the level that would mandate retreat by any standard mountaineering judgment. Ryan made the call to continue. It was a reasonable call at the time. It proved fatal in retrospect. And that gap, between what seemed reasonable in the moment and what proved catastrophic afterward, is the heart of this tragedy. The climbing party arrived at Camp Sherman on June 9th or 10th, 1996. They had already completed the arduous approach, the 8-mile hike from the White River trailhead, the 5,000 feet of elevation gain, the transition from old-growth forest to alpine meadow to glacial moraine. They had practiced their skills at lower elevations. They had checked their equipment. They were acclimated as much as possible to the altitude. Now they waited. Camp Sherman sits at 9,500 feet on Steamboat Prow, a rocky ridge between the Emmons and Winthrop glaciers. During the climbing season, the National Park Service maintains a small ranger station, a hut barely large enough for a couple of bunks and some emergency supplies. Climbing parties camp on snow platforms carved into the glacier, their tents buffeted by the persistent wind that flows down from the summit. The view from Camp Sherman is extraordinary. The upper mountain rises directly above, its glaciers gleaming in the sunlight, its summit crater seeming almost close enough to touch. To the east, the Cascade foothills roll away toward the Columbia Plateau. On clear mornings, the first light of dawn paints the ice in shades of pink and gold. It is a place of profound beauty. It is also a place of profound exposure. On the evening of June 10th, the guides made their decision. The weather forecast, such as it was, suggested a window of acceptable conditions. The sky showed some high cirrus clouds, wisps of ice crystal at extreme altitude that can indicate approaching moisture, but nothing definitive. The barometric pressure was stable, the wind was moderate, the temperature was cold but manageable. The guides decided to attempt the summit the following morning. They would depart at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, climbing through the pre-dawn darkness to take advantage of the firmest snow conditions. They would aim to reach the summit by mid-morning and descend, before the afternoon sun softened the snow and increased the danger of crevasse collapse. If everything went according to plan, they would be back at Camp Sherman by early afternoon. Exhausted but triumphant. Everything did not go according to plan. There is a phrase in mountaineering for what the climbing party did on the morning of June 11th. An alpine start. It means departing in darkness, often at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, to maximize the hours of climbing time before afternoon conditions deteriorate. On glaciated peaks like Rainier, the alpine start serves a specific purpose. Snow that has frozen solid overnight is safer to travel on than snow that has softened in the sun. Crevasses are less likely to collapse when their snow bridges are frozen. Avalanche danger is lower on cold, consolidated slopes. The alpine start is a standard practice on Rainier. Every guided party attempting the summit follows a similar schedule, rising at midnight or earlier, eating a quick breakfast, checking equipment in the cold and the dark, roping up by headlamp, and beginning the ascent while the rest of the world sleeps. At approximately 2 o'clock on the morning of June 11th, the Alpine Ascent's party departed Camp Sherman. The temperature was well below freezing. The air was still, or nearly so, with only the faintest breath of wind stirring the surface of the glacier. The climbers moved in darkness, their headlamps creating narrow cones of light that illuminated only a few feet ahead. Beyond the reach of their beams, the mountain was invisible. A vast presence felt rather than seen, looming above them in the black. They moved as rope teams, typically 3 or 4 climbers per rope, with guides positioned at the front and back of each team. The rope served as their primary safety system. If one climber fell into a crevasse, the others would arrest the fall, dig in, execute a rescue. The spacing between climbers, typically 40 to 50 feet, was calculated to minimize the chance that 2 people would fall into the same crevasse while maximizing the team's ability to arrest a fall. Progress was steady but slow. At altitude, even well-conditioned climbers move at a fraction of their sea level pace. The air at 9,500 feet contains approximately 70% of the oxygen available at sea level. At 14,000 feet, it contains less than 60%. The body, starved of oxygen, responds by slowing everything down. Heart rate, breathing, muscle function, cognitive processing. Steps that would take seconds at sea level take minutes. Decisions that would be instantaneous require conscious effort. The climbers ascended the lower Emmons Glacier in darkness, weaving between crevasse fields marked by bamboo wands placed earlier in the season. The crunch of crampons on frozen snow was the dominant sound, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that would become the background music of the next several hours. Breath fogged in the cold air. Headlamps bobbed up and down as climbers moved in the slow, deliberate cadence of high-altitude travel. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. The task was simple: put one foot in front of the other, follow the rope, watch for crevasses, keep moving. Above them, still invisible in the darkness, the summit waited. And above the summit, the atmosphere was already beginning to shift. Dawn comes slowly on Mount Rainier. The first hint is not light but color, a gradual warming of the eastern horizon from black to deep purple to rose. Then the light begins to leak across the sky, illuminating first the highest clouds, then the summit, then the upper glaciers, until finally the entire mountain is bathed in the golden glow of sunrise. On the morning of June 11th, the climbers witnessed this transformation from approximately 11,000 feet on the Emmons Glacier. They had been climbing for 3 to 4 hours. They had ascended approximately 1,500 vertical feet from Camp Sherman. They were tired but making good progress. The summit, now visible in the growing light, appeared tantalizingly close, perhaps 3 more hours of climbing, perhaps 4. But as the light strengthened, some climbers, and certainly the guides, noticed something else. The sky to the west, toward the Pacific Ocean, had a quality that experienced mountaineers learned to recognize. It was not overcast exactly. It was not cloudy in the conventional sense. It was hazy, a milky, diffuse quality that suggested moisture at high altitude. And above the summit, or slightly to one side, a lens-shaped formation was beginning to develop. A lenticular cloud. On Mount Rainier, lenticular clouds are one of the most important weather indicators available. They signal that moist air is being forced over the summit, condensing as it rises, potentially building toward a storm. Veteran Rainier guides have learned to watch lenticular formations closely, assessing their development, their density, their position relative to the summit. But here is the critical point. Lenticular clouds on Rainier form regularly and often dissipate without producing significant weather at climbing altitude. A guide looking at a developing lenticular at 6 o'clock in the morning cannot know whether that formation will build into a storm or evaporate harmlessly by midday. Experience helps. Guides develop intuition for which formations look dangerous and which look benign, but experience is not certainty. The mountain does not announce its intentions. On the morning of June 11th, the lenticular was forming but had not yet produced storm conditions at the climber's elevation. The wind was increasing somewhat. The sky was hazier than it had been at dawn. But conditions at 11,000 feet remained tolerable. Cold, windy, but not yet dangerous. The guides assessed the situation. The assessment was genuinely difficult. They could turn back now, descend to Camp Sherman, wait for clearer conditions. But if the storm never materialized, they would have aborted a summit attempt unnecessarily. Their clients would be disappointed. The company would lose a successful climb. Or they could continue, monitor conditions as they ascended, plan to turn back if the weather deteriorated significantly. They chose to continue. This was not an unreasonable decision at 6 o'clock in the morning. It became an unreasonable decision, catastrophically so by noon. But by then, it was too late to change course. The hours between dawn and mid-morning were the hours when the disaster was set in motion, but not yet inevitable. The climbing party continued ascending the Emmons Glacier, moving slowly but steadily upward through a landscape of ice and snow. The route steepened as they climbed. The crevasses became more frequent, forcing the rope teams to navigate around open cracks and across snow bridges of uncertain stability. At approximately 7 o'clock, they passed 10,000 feet. At approximately 8 o'clock, they passed 11,000 feet. At approximately 9 o'clock, they passed 12,000 feet. With each hour, they moved deeper into the upper mountains environment and farther from safety. Above 12,000 feet, the Emmons Glacier enters its most exposed section. The route crosses a broad, open snowfield with crevasses scattered throughout. There is no shelter, no rock outcroppings, no ridges, nothing but glacier extending in every direction. Weather from the Pacific strikes this section of the mountain with minimal warning. A storm that takes hours to develop at sea level can materialize in minutes at this elevation. The climbers were now committed. Not irrevocably committed, they could still have turned back at this point, and the descent, while long, would have been feasible. But committed in the sense that every step upward increased the distance to safety and the exposure to weather that was visibly deteriorating. The lenticular cloud over the summit was growing. The sky was increasingly overcast. The wind was strengthening. Some of the clients may have noticed these changes. Some may have wondered whether they should continue. But the decision was not theirs to make. They were clients on a guided climb. They had paid for professional leadership. They trusted the guides to make the right call. The guides continued climbing. At approximately 10 o'clock, the party reached approximately 13,000 feet. They were now at the critical decision point. The last practical turnaround before the route entered the most heavily crevassed section of the upper glacier. Above this elevation, descent in deteriorating weather would be increasingly dangerous. Below this elevation, retreat was still feasible. The guide stopped to assess conditions. The lenticular cloud had grown significantly. The wind had increased. Visibility was beginning to decrease as high clouds moved in. Some clients were struggling with the altitude and the cold. The summit was still at least 2 to 3 hours away, close, but not close enough to ignore the worsening weather. This was the moment. If the guides had turned back at 13,000 feet on the morning of June 11th, the disaster would not have happened. The party would have descended to Camp Sherman, disappointed but alive. The clients would have gone home with stories of the summit they almost reached. Patrick Nestler and John Craver would have lived to climb another day. But the guides did not turn back. They looked at the sky. They assessed the conditions. They weighed the proximity of the summit against the deterioration of the weather. And they made a judgment call. They decided to continue. It was the decision that sealed their fate. Above 13,000 feet, the climbing party entered a different world. The glacier steepened. The crevasses multiplied, some visible as dark gashes in the ice, others hidden beneath thin crusts of wind-packed snow. The wind, which had been strengthening all morning, now gusted strongly enough to stagger climbers who were not braced for it. The temperature, already bitter, dropped further as they climbed into the cloud layer that was descending over the mountain. The summit, so tantalizingly close just hours earlier, became increasingly difficult to see. The milky haze that had tinged the morning sky thickened into overcast, then into fog, then into something worse. At approximately 11 o'clock, the party reached approximately 13,500 feet. At approximately noon, they reached approximately 13,800 feet. They were now less than 700 vertical feet from the summit. On a clear day at sea level, 700 feet is nothing, a few minutes of walking. On Mount Rainier, at altitude in deteriorating conditions, it might as well have been 700 miles. And then the storm hit. It did not arrive gradually. It did not build slowly from overcast to rain to full tempest. It struck with the sudden, overwhelming violence that only a major mountain can produce. One moment the climbers could see the slope above them, white snow fading into gray cloud, but still visible, still navigable. The next moment they could see nothing. The whiteout descended like a curtain. Visibility dropped from hundreds of feet to tens of feet to single digits. The wind, which had been gusting, became sustained, 50 miles per hour, then 60, then 70, with gusts higher still. Snow that had been falling lightly became horizontal, driving into their faces with stinging force. The temperature, already cold, plummeted as the wind chill took hold. What had been merely uncomfortable became dangerous. Exposed skin began to freeze within minutes. Moisture in clothing, sweat from the morning's exertion, began to turn to ice. And all around them, invisible in the white, the crevasses waited. The guides made the only decision that made sense under the circumstances. They stopped. They could not continue toward the summit. They could not even see the summit. They could not descend. The crevasses that had been visible on the way up were now invisible in the whiteout, and a single wrong step could send a climber plunging into a crack hundreds of feet deep. They could only stay where they were. They began to dig. Snow caves, emergency shelters, holes in the glacier that might protect them from the wind, that might trap enough body heat to keep them alive until the storm passed. They had no way of knowing that the storm would not pass for more than 40 hours. They had no way of knowing that 2 of their number would never leave the mountain alive. All they knew was that the sky had closed. The wind was screaming, and they were trapped at 13,800 feet on the most exposed glacier in the contiguous United States. The disaster had begun. There is a phenomenon in mountaineering called a whiteout. Until you have experienced one, it is almost impossible to understand how completely it can disorient the human mind. In a whiteout, the sky and the ground become indistinguishable. There are no shadows because there is no direct light, only a diffuse, gray-white glow that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There is no horizon because there is nothing to separate earth from air. The world becomes a featureless void. Up and down lose meaning. Left and right become indistinguishable. Forward and backward blend into a seamless nothing that the mind cannot interpret. Experienced mountaineers describe the sensation as being inside a ping-pong ball. Others compare it to sensory deprivation, the disorientation that comes when the brain, receiving no useful visual information, begins to invent its own. Climbers in whiteout conditions have walked in circles for hours, believing they were traveling in a straight line. They have stepped off cliffs they could not see. They have fallen into crevasses that were invisible until the moment the snow gave way beneath their feet. On the afternoon of June 11th, 1996, the climbing party on Mount Rainier entered a whiteout so complete that visibility was measured not in feet but in inches. The storm arrived with almost no warning. One moment the climbers could see the slope above them, could identify the general direction of the summit, could navigate by the visual cues that experienced mountaineers learn to read. The next moment, all of that was gone. The lenticular cloud that had been building all morning collapsed onto the mountain, engulfing everything above 12,000 feet in a dense, impenetrable fog. The wind, which had been gusting throughout the morning, intensified into a sustained gale. 50 miles per hour. 60. 70. with gusts that approached hurricane force. The temperature, which had already been well below freezing, dropped further as the wind chill took hold. At 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, a reasonable estimate of the wind chill at 13,800 feet in a 70-mile-per-hour wind, exposed flesh freezes in less than 5 minutes. Frostbite can begin in seconds on any skin that is not protected. The climbers were not prepared for this. They were equipped for a single-day summit push, not for a multi-day survival situation in extreme conditions. They carried emergency bivouac gear, lightweight bivy sacks, thin sleeping bags designed for a few hours of unexpected delay, perhaps a small stove and a few fuel canisters for melting snow into drinking water. They had food for the day, energy bars, maybe some chocolate, the high-calorie snacks that climbers consume during exertion. None of this was adequate for what the mountain was about to demand. The guides recognized immediately that they could not continue upward. The summit, less than 700 vertical feet away, might as well have been on the moon. They could not see it. They could not navigate toward it. Any attempt to climb higher would be suicidal. But they also recognized that they could not descend. Between their current position and the safety of Camp Sherman lay approximately 4,300 vertical feet of heavily crevassed glacier. The route was marked with bamboo wands, but in the whiteout, those wands were invisible beyond a distance of a few feet. The crevasses that they had carefully navigated on the way up were now hidden beneath a seamless white surface, indistinguishable from solid ground until the moment a climber stepped onto a snow bridge that collapsed. Descending in these conditions would be gambling with lives. Not just one life. The lives of every person on the rope team. A single misstep could send multiple climbers into a crevasse. A rescue in whiteout conditions, with freezing wind and zero visibility, would be nearly impossible. The guides made the only decision that made sense. They would dig in and wait. The storm would pass. It had to pass. Storms always pass eventually. When visibility improved enough to navigate safely, they would descend to Camp Sherman and evaluate their situation. They began to dig. Digging a snow cave at 13,800 feet in a 70-mile-per-hour wind, with the temperature dropping toward minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, is one of the most exhausting things a human body can do. At that altitude, the air contains less than 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. Every movement requires conscious effort. The muscles, starved of oxygen, burn with fatigue after only minutes of sustained exertion. The lungs heave. The heart pounds. The mind, dulled by cold and hypoxia, struggles to maintain focus on the task at hand. And the task was urgent. The climbers needed shelter, not in an hour, not when they finished resting, but immediately. Every minute they spent exposed to the wind was a minute that their core temperatures dropped, a minute that their clothing absorbed moisture from sweat and snow, a minute that frostbite crept into their fingers and toes and faces. They dug with ice axes, with shovels, with their gloved hands. They carved into the glacier's surface, excavating blocks of wind-packed snow and piling them to windward to create walls. They hollowed out spaces barely large enough for 2 or 3 people to huddle together, their bodies curled into fetal positions to conserve heat. The caves they dug were not the elaborate shelters that appear in survival manuals. Those carefully engineered structures with sleeping platforms and ventilation holes and curved walls designed to trap warm air. Those require time and energy and conditions far better than what the mountain was providing. What they created were crude holes in the snow, barely adequate to block the direct assault of the wind. The temperature inside was warmer than outside, perhaps 20 or 25 degrees Fahrenheit instead of the minus 20 wind chill on the surface, but it was still cold enough to kill. The party split into multiple groups, each occupying a separate snow cave or shelter. The exact configuration is not clear from the available records, but the result was that the climbers were separated, not by hundreds of feet, but by enough distance that communication between groups was difficult in the screaming wind. This separation would have consequences. As the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no sign of abating, the climbers settled into their shelters to wait. Wait for the storm to pass. Wait for visibility to improve. Wait for rescue that might or might not be coming. They did not know how long they would wait. They did not know that they would spend 2 nights on the mountain. They did not know that one of their number was about to become separated from the group, and that the separation would be permanent. All they knew was that they were alive, for now, and that the mountain was not finished with them. Sometime during the chaos of the storm's arrival, during the confusion of the whiteout's descent, the scramble to find shelter, the desperate digging, John Craver became separated from the main group. The exact circumstances of his separation are not fully documented. In conditions where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet, where the wind was loud enough to drown out shouting, where the simple act of moving from one position to another required all of a person's concentration, it is possible that Craver's absence was not immediately noticed. Perhaps he fell behind as the group moved to dig shelters. Perhaps he was part of a rope team that became disoriented in the whiteout. Perhaps he stepped away from the group for some reason, to relieve himself, to retrieve a piece of equipment, and was unable to find his way back. Whatever the reason, by the time the group realized that Craver was missing, the storm had made any search impossible. Consider the situation the guides faced. They had 10 or more climbers huddled in hastily dug snow caves at 13,800 feet. The wind was gusting to hurricane force. Visibility was effectively zero. The temperature was dropping toward conditions that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. One of their clients was missing, somewhere out there in the white, perhaps only 100 feet away, perhaps already in a crevasse, perhaps still moving and disoriented, wandering deeper into the glacier. If they sent searchers into the storm to find Craver, they risked losing the searchers as well. In a whiteout, a person who moves out of contact with the group can become hopelessly lost within seconds. The searchers would be gambling their lives on the chance of finding one person in an environment where navigation was impossible. If they stayed in their shelters and waited for the storm to pass, they abandoned Craver to whatever fate the mountain chose to deliver. It was an impossible choice, the kind of choice that no training prepares you for, no manual covers, no ethical framework resolves. The guides chose to shelter in place. They chose not to send searchers into the storm. They chose to hope that Craver had found his own shelter, that he was huddled somewhere on the glacier, waiting out the storm as they were. It was a reasonable choice under the circumstances. It was also a choice that meant John Craver would face the storm alone. We do not know the exact circumstances of Craver's final hours. We do not know whether he dug a shelter of his own, whether he wandered until exhaustion took him, whether he fell into a crevasse or simply lay down in the snow and let the cold claim him. What we know is that he was found dead on the upper mountain when the storm finally cleared, somewhere in the crevassed terrain above 13,000 feet. Alone, frozen, beyond any help that his companions could have provided. His death was the first of the disaster. It would not be the last. As darkness fell on June 11th, the climbing party was trapped, 13,800 feet above sea level, approximately 4,300 vertical feet above Camp Sherman and any meaningful shelter, more than 10,000 vertical feet above the roads and hospitals and warm buildings of the lowlands. separated from safety by miles of crevassed glacier that they could not navigate in the whiteout. And the storm was not weakening. If anything, it was intensifying. The wind, which had been brutal during the afternoon, became worse as night approached. The temperature, which had been dangerous, dropped further. The snow, which had been falling heavily, accumulated on the surface of the glacier and drifted against the windward walls of their snow caves. Inside the caves, the climbers huddled together. There is no comfortable way to spend a night in a snow cave at 13,000 feet without proper expedition gear. The climbers had lightweight bivy sacks, thin shells designed to add a few degrees of warmth to a sleeping bag, not to function as primary shelter. They had emergency sleeping bags, the kind rated for temperatures far warmer than what they were experiencing. They had the clothing they had worn for the summit push, multiple layers of fleece and Gore-Tex, designed for exertion, not for lying still in a frozen hole. When you exert yourself at altitude, your body generates heat. The multiple layers trap that heat against your skin, keeping you warm even in extreme cold. But when you stop moving, when you lie still in a snow cave, conserving energy, waiting for a storm to pass, your body stops generating heat. The layers that kept you warm during exertion become inadequate for rest. The sweat that accumulated in your clothing during the climb begins to freeze, turning your insulation into a refrigerator. This is the trap of hypothermia at altitude. You cannot move because movement exposes you to the wind and the whiteout. You cannot stay still because stillness allows the cold to creep into your core. You can only endure, flexing your fingers and toes to maintain circulation, shivering as your body burns its last reserves to generate heat, hoping that the storm will pass before your reserves are exhausted. The climbers talked at first. They shared whatever food they had, the energy bars and chocolate that were supposed to fuel a single day of climbing, now rationed to last an unknown duration. They melted snow for water, burning precious fuel from their small stoves, knowing that dehydration would accelerate hypothermia, but that they had only limited fuel to melt more snow. As the hours passed, conversation faded. The exhaustion of the morning's climb, combined with the stress of the storm and the onset of cold, drained the energy required for speech. The climbers retreated into themselves, into the small private battles that each was fighting against the cold. Some slept fitfully, waking repeatedly as the cold penetrated their inadequate insulation. Some lay awake, listening to the wind, wondering when it would stop. Some prayed. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind on Mount Rainier during a major storm is not merely weather. It is an assault on the senses so sustained and so overwhelming that it becomes a form of psychological warfare. Survivors of the June 1996 disaster described the sound of the wind in terms that conveyed not just volume but malevolence. It was not a howl. That word implies something periodic, something that rises and falls. This was a constant roar. A freight train that never passed. A waterfall of noise that drowned out thought and speech and hope. At 60 or 70 miles per hour, wind does not merely move air. It weaponizes it. It picks up snow and ice crystals and drives them horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin through clothing. It finds every gap in a shelter, every crevice in a snow cave wall, every imperfect seal around a bivy sack, and forces its way through, stealing heat from bodies that have no heat to spare. The psychological effect is cumulative. In the first hours of a storm, the mind remains optimistic. The storm will pass, the wind will die down, this is temporary, just wait it out. As the hours stretch on, 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, optimism gives way to anxiety. When will it end? How much longer can I take this? What if it doesn't stop? By the middle of the night, anxiety can give way to despair. The storm seems eternal. The cold seems to be winning. The body is exhausted and the mind is not far behind. This is the point at which survival becomes a matter of will. Not skill, not equipment, not training. Will. The decision made moment by moment to keep fighting, to keep flexing fingers and toes, to keep shivering when the body wants to stop, to keep hopping when hope seems irrational. Inside the snow caves on Mount Rainier, the climbers fought these battles individually. They could not help each other, not in any meaningful way. They could huddle together for shared warmth, but the heat they could share was minimal. They could encourage each other, but encouragement rings hollow when you are both freezing and exhausted and trapped. Each person was alone with the cold and the wind and the question, how long can I last? Some had more reserves than others. Some were stronger, younger, better acclimatized, better insulated. Some had already pushed themselves harder during the climb and had less left to give. Patrick Nestler, at 34 years old, was fit and enthusiastic. He had trained for this climb. He was not weak or unprepared by any normal standard. But somewhere during that first night, or during the day that followed, his reserves began to run out. The cold was winning, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. When dawn came on June 12, 1996, the climbers trapped on Mount Rainier emerged from their snow caves hopping to see clear skies. They did not see clear skies. The storm continued. The wind continued. The whiteout continued. Visibility remained effectively zero, a gray-white void that offered no reference points, no landmarks, no indication of where the crevasses lay or which direction led to safety. The despair of this moment is difficult to overstate. They had survived the night. They had endured 12 or 14 hours of cold and wind and exhaustion, telling themselves that morning would bring relief, that the storm could not last forever, that rescue, or at least self-rescue, would become possible when the sun came up. And now the sun was up, somewhere behind the clouds, and nothing had changed. The storm was not ending. They were not getting out. Not yet. The guides assessed their situation with the grim pragmatism that their profession requires. Their supplies were limited. They had rationed their food through the night, but they did not have enough for another full day, much less another night. Their fuel for melting snow was running low. Their emergency bivouac equipment was not designed for extended survival at altitude. It was designed to keep you alive for a few hours until conditions improved. Conditions were not improving. Their clients were deteriorating. Some showed signs of frostbite, blackened fingertips and toes, the telltale indicators that tissue was freezing and dying. Some were lethargic, their movements slow and uncoordinated, their speech slurred, the early signs of hypothermia advancing from mild to moderate. Some were simply exhausted beyond the point of useful function, their bodies having burned through reserves that could not be replaced. And one of their clients was missing. John Craver had not returned during the night. He had not appeared at the snow caves with the dawn. He was out there somewhere on the glacier, or he was not out there at all, had fallen into a crevasse or frozen in his tracks. The guides could not search for him. The conditions remained too dangerous. Sending searchers into the whiteout would only create more casualties. They could only wait and hope and try to keep the people they still had alive. The guides carried radios. This was standard equipment for commercial climbing parties on Mount Rainier, handheld radios that could communicate with the ranger station at Camp Sherman and, through Camp Sherman, with National Park Service headquarters in Longmire. Throughout June 11th and into June 12th, the guides attempted to communicate their situation to the outside world. Communication was difficult. The storm interfered with radio signals. The terrain, steep mountain walls and deep glacial valleys, created shadows and dead zones where transmissions would not go through. The radios themselves were consumer-grade equipment, not military-spec gear designed for extreme conditions. Batteries drained faster in the cold. Reception was intermittent. The messages that did get through were fragmented but urgent. Trapped. Whiteout. Cannot descend. Need help. At Camp Sherman, the climbing ranger, if one was stationed there at that time, received the transmissions and relayed them to Park Service headquarters. At headquarters, officials began to mobilize rescue resources. But rescue, in June of 1996, was not a simple matter. Helicopter operations at high altitude on Mount Rainier were dangerous under the best conditions. At 13,800 feet, the air is thin enough that helicopters operate at the margins of their performance envelopes. The lift that keeps a helicopter aloft depends on air density, and at altitude, with the air significantly thinner than at sea level, helicopters struggle to hover, to land, to take off with any significant payload. In a storm, with winds of 60 to 70 miles per hour, with visibility near zero, with turbulence and updrafts and downdrafts that could smash a helicopter into the mountainside, high-altitude helicopter operations were effectively impossible. The rescue teams could not reach the stranded climbers. Not until the storm moderated. Not until visibility improved. Not until the mountain allowed it. The Park Service began mobilizing resources, coordinating with the military, which had Chinook helicopters capable of high-altitude operations, and with experienced rescue climbers who could potentially reach the stranded party on foot. But all of these resources were useless until the weather changed. And the weather was not changing. On the upper Emmons Glacier, the climbers continued to wait. Another day. Another night. The cold continued its work. June 12, 1996, was longer than any day should be. The climbers had now been trapped on the mountain for more than 30 hours. They had been awake, with only fitful rest, for nearly 40 hours, since rising at midnight on June 10th to prepare for the summit push that now seemed like something from another lifetime. Their bodies were failing. Hypothermia in its early stages is insidious. The body's core temperature drops a degree or two below normal, 95 or 96 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 98.6. The victim feels cold, of course, but also feels something more subtle. A dulling of the mind. A slowing of reactions. A sense that everything requires more effort than it should. As hypothermia progresses, the symptoms worsen. Shivering, the body's primary mechanism for generating heat, becomes violent and uncontrollable. Speech becomes slurred. Coordination deteriorates. Simple tasks, buckling a strap, pulling on a glove, become frustratingly difficult. In moderate hypothermia, with core temperatures in the low 90s, the shivering may actually stop. This is not a sign of improvement. It is a sign that the body has exhausted its ability to generate heat through muscle contractions. The victim becomes paradoxically calm, even warm feeling, as the blood vessels near the skin surface dilate in a last desperate attempt to warm the extremities. This is the point at which death becomes likely. And this is the point that Patrick Nestler was approaching. We do not know precisely when Nestler's condition became critical. We do not know whether he was among the weaker climbers from the beginning or whether he deteriorated faster than the others for reasons that remain unclear. A less efficient metabolism, worse insulation, a lower baseline of physical reserves. What we know is that by the second day of the storm, Nestler was in serious trouble. His companions recognized the signs. They tried to help him. They shared what warmth they could, body heat, the inadequate insulation of their emergency gear. They tried to keep him awake, knowing that sleep in severe hypothermia can become a one-way journey. They gave him whatever food and water they had left, hoping that calories might reignite the metabolic furnace that was flickering out. But there is a limit to what willpower and companionship can do against cold. The temperature inside the snow cave was still below freezing. The wind outside was still howling. They had no way to build a fire, no way to generate significant external heat, no way to reverse the thermodynamic reality that their bodies were losing heat faster than they could produce it. Patrick Nestler continued to deteriorate. Here is the mathematics of what killed Patrick Nestler. A human body at rest generates approximately 80 to 100 watts of heat. This is roughly equivalent to a standard incandescent light bulb. It is enough to maintain core temperature in moderate conditions, in a room at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, or outside on a mild day with a light breeze. But heat generation is only half of the equation. The other half is heat loss. The human body loses heat through 4 mechanisms: radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Radiation is the emission of infrared energy from the body's surface. It accounts for about 40% of heat loss in still air at moderate temperatures. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact with cold surfaces. It is normally a minor factor, but becomes significant when a person is lying on ice or snow. Convection is the transfer of heat to moving air. It is the mechanism behind wind chill, the reason that a 20-degree day with a 30-mile-per-hour wind feels like a 0-degree day with no wind. Evaporation is the loss of heat through the vaporization of water, sweat, moisture in exhaled breath, water in clothing. In the snow caves on Mount Rainier, all 4 mechanisms were working against the climbers. They were radiating heat into an environment that was well below freezing. They were conducting heat into the snow and ice on which they lay. They were losing heat through convection every time wind penetrated their inadequate shelters. And they were losing heat through evaporation as the moisture in their sweat-soaked clothing turned to vapor. The emergency bivouac equipment they carried was designed to slow these losses, but not to stop them. A lightweight bivy sack might add 10 or 15 degrees of warmth to a sleeping bag. An emergency sleeping bag might be rated to 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Layered clothing might provide another 20 or 30 degrees of protection. Add it all up, and you might be able to survive a night at 0 degrees Fahrenheit in calm conditions. But the conditions on Mount Rainier were not calm. The wind chill was driving effective temperatures to -20, -30, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The moisture in their clothing was accelerating heat loss through evaporation. The inadequate insulation beneath them was allowing conductive heat loss into the glacier. They were losing heat faster than they could produce it. For some, the strongest, the best insulated, the luckiest, the margin was just enough. They could shiver through the night, burn their remaining reserves, and emerge alive when the storm finally broke. For Patrick Nestler, the margin was not enough. The equation tipped against him. And once it tipped, there was nothing anyone could do. The night of June 12th into June 13th was the longest night of the survivors' lives. Patrick Nestler was dying, and they knew it. They had done everything they could. They had shared their body heat. They had tried to keep him awake. They had given him food and water. They had spoken to him, encouraged him, told him that rescue was coming, that the storm would break, that he just had to hold on a little longer. But his core temperature continued to drop. His shivering, which had been violent and uncontrollable, became intermittent, and then stopped. His speech, which had been slurred but coherent, became mumbled, and then ceased. His movements, which had been weak but purposeful, became random, and then still. At some point during that night, we do not know the exact hour, Patrick Nestler's heart stopped beating. He was 34 years old. He died surrounded by people who had done everything in their power to save him and failed. He died 600 feet below a summit he had dreamed of reaching. He died less than 5 miles from the safety of Camp Sherman, separated from rescue by a whiteout that would not lift and crevasses that would not disappear. He died because the mountain did not care about his dreams, his training, his preparation, his guides, or his equipment. He died because the gap between what he carried and what he needed was approximately 30 degrees Fahrenheit of insulation and 40 hours of fuel. He died because commercial mountaineering on Mount Rainier was optimized for the mountain's average behavior. And the mountain delivered its worst. The survivors did what survivors do. They noted the time, or their best estimate of it. They arranged his body as respectfully as they could in the confined space of the snow cave. They said whatever words seemed appropriate, prayers perhaps, or simple statements of grief. And then they turned their attention back to their own survival. Because the storm was not over. Because they were not rescued yet. Because they could still join Patrick Nestler if they allowed despair to defeat them. They had to keep fighting. For themselves. For the families waiting at home. For the simple, primal imperative to survive. When dawn came on June 13, 1996, something had changed. The wind, which had been a constant roar for more than 40 hours, was beginning to moderate. The visibility, which had been measured in inches, was beginning to open up, not to clear skis, not yet, but to something better than the absolute whiteout of the previous days. The survivors emerged from their snow caves to assess the situation. They were in terrible condition. Multiple climbers showed severe frostbite, fingers and toes blackened, the tissue dying or already dead. Some could barely walk. Some could barely think clearly, their minds still dulled by hypothermia and exhaustion and the psychological trauma of what they had experienced. One of their companions was dead in the snow cave behind them. Another, John Craver, was still missing somewhere out there on the glacier. But they were alive. And if the weather continued to improve, they might be able to descend to Camp Sherman. Or rescue might be able to reach them. Below, on the lower mountain and in the valleys, the rescue operation was already in motion. The National Park Service had been mobilizing resources for more than a day. Climbing rangers were preparing to ascend toward the stranded party on foot. Military helicopters from Fort Lewis were on standby, waiting for conditions to improve enough to attempt a high-altitude extraction. 𝗵𝗃𝗺𝗃, the climbing ranger who would coordinate the rescue, was assessing the situation from below. He knew that climbers were trapped at approximately 13,800 feet. He knew that they had been caught in a major storm. He knew that they had limited supplies and inadequate shelter. He did not yet know that one climber was dead and another was missing. What he knew was that time was running out. The survivors had been exposed for nearly 50 hours. Even if they had survived so far, they might not survive much longer. Every additional hour increased the risk of additional casualties. The rescue had to happen soon. And for the first time since June 11th, the weather was beginning to cooperate. On the morning of June 13th, as the storm began to moderate, the rescue operation shifted from planning to action. From Camp Sherman at 9,500 feet, climbing rangers and rescue volunteers began ascending toward the stranded party. They moved in rope teams, following the route that the Alpine Ascents expedition had taken 2 days earlier, the same route that was now marked not just by bamboo wands but by the knowledge that somewhere up there, people were dying. The conditions were still marginal. The wind had decreased but not ceased. Visibility had improved but was still limited. The danger of crevasse falls remained significant, perhaps more significant than before, because the storm had deposited fresh snow that could hide crevasses that had been visible earlier. The rescuers climbed quickly but carefully. They could not afford to become casualties themselves. A rescue operation that puts rescuers at unacceptable risk is not a rescue, it is a compounding of the original tragedy. At the same time, military assets were being mobilized for a helicopter extraction. The aircraft designated for the mission was a 𝗬𝗪𝗎𝗄 Chinook, a heavy-lift helicopter used by the United States Army. The Chinook has twin rotors that give it more lifting power than conventional helicopters, allowing it to operate at higher altitudes and with heavier payloads. But even a Chinook has limits. At 13,800 feet, the air is thin enough that the aircraft operates at the margins of its capabilities. The pilots assigned to the mission were experienced in high-altitude operations, but what they were being asked to do was extraordinary. Land a helicopter on a glacier at nearly 14,000 feet. Load casualties who might not be able to walk. Take off again without crashing into the mountainside. This had been done before on Mount Rainier, but rarely, and never in conditions as marginal as those on June 13th. The decision was made to attempt the helicopter extraction. If the helicopter could not land safely, the ground teams would continue ascending and bring the survivors down on foot. But a helicopter extraction would be faster, and speed might mean the difference between life and death for climbers with severe hypothermia and frostbite. The Chinook lifted off from Fort Lewis and headed toward Mount Rainier. Flying a helicopter to 13,800 feet on Mount Rainier is not like flying a helicopter anywhere else. The air is thin. The rotor blades, designed to bite into dense sea-level atmosphere, struggle to generate lift. The engines, calibrated for lower altitudes, work harder and produce less power. The margin for error, always slim in helicopter operations, shrinks to almost nothing. And the terrain is unforgiving. Mount Rainier is not a gentle slope but a steep-sided volcanic cone, its glaciers fractured by crevasses and punctuated by ice cliffs. A helicopter that loses power, that encounters unexpected turbulence, that misjudges its approach, can find itself with nowhere to go but down. And down on Mount Rainier means into the ice. The Chinook pilots approaching the upper Emmons Glacier on June 13th were aware of all this. They flew carefully, reading the wind, watching for turbulence, constantly calculating whether they had enough power, enough lift, enough margin to complete the mission safely. As they approached the coordinates where the stranded party was located, they could see the snow caves, or rather, they could see the disturbances in the snow surface that indicated where the caves had been dug. They could see figures emerging from the caves, waving, signaling. The survivors were alive. Some of them at least. The helicopter approached the landing zone. The pilots assessed the surface. Was it solid enough to support the aircraft's weight? Were there hidden crevasses? Was the slope too steep for a safe landing? They made their decision. They landed. The rotors continued spinning as the rescue team jumped out and ran toward the survivors. The helicopter could not stay on the ground for long. The longer it sat, the greater the risk that something would go wrong. The rescuers reached the snow caves. What they found was both better and worse than they had feared. Better because most of the climbers were still alive. Hypothermic, frostbitten, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. Worse because Patrick Nestler was dead in one of the caves, and John Craver was still missing. There was no time for extended assessment. The survivors who could move were helped toward the helicopter. Those who could not move were carried. The dead Patrick Nestler's body would have to be recovered later, There was no room, no time, no margin for anything except getting the living off the mountain. The helicopter lifted off with the survivors aboard. It descended toward Madigan Army Medical Center at Fort Lewis, where trauma teams were waiting to treat the casualties. The rescue was complete, at least for the living. But the mountain still held 2 of its victims. As the weather continued to improve on June 13th and into June 14th, search teams returned to the upper Emmons Glacier. They were looking for John Craver. The search was methodical and grim. The teams worked in rope teams, probing the snow, scanning the glacier surface for any sign of the missing climber. They knew by this point that the chances of finding Craver alive were essentially 0. He had been missing for more than 2 days in conditions that no one could survive without shelter. They were not searching for a survivor. They were searching for a body. They found him somewhere on the upper glacier. The exact location is not specified in the available records. He was dead, frozen, alone. The circumstances of his final hours remain unknown. Did he find shelter of some kind, a shallow depression, a crevassed lip, or did he simply stop moving when exhaustion took him? Did he call out for help that never came, or did the wind drown his voice before it could reach anyone? Did he know that his companions were only a few hundred feet away, or did the whiteout make him feel as isolated as if he were on another planet? These questions have no answers. What we know is that John Craver died alone, separated from his companions by a few hundred feet of glacier that might as well have been 100 miles. What we know is that the decision not to send searchers into the storm, a decision that was almost certainly correct, given the conditions, meant that he faced his final hours without human contact. What we know is that the mountain does not distinguish between those who make reasonable decisions and those who make unreasonable ones. It simply delivers consequences. John Craver's body was recovered and brought down from the mountain. He was the second fatality of the June 1996 disaster. He would not be the last person to die on Mount Rainier that year, or any year. The mountain continues to claim lives, as it has for more than a century, as it will continue to do for as long as humans attempt to climb it. But for the families of Patrick Nestler and John Craver, the statistics offer no comfort. Their loved ones were not statistics. They were people, and they are gone. The survivors of the June 1996 disaster were evacuated to hospitals, where the extent of their injuries became clear. Multiple climbers suffered severe frostbite. Frostbite in its most serious forms destroys tissue permanently. The blood vessels in the affected areas, usually fingers and toes, but sometimes ears, noses, and faces, are damaged beyond repair. The tissue dies. If the damage is severe enough, amputation is required. Several survivors of the Rainier disaster lost fingers. Some lost toes. The amputations were not immediate. Frostbite takes time to declare its full extent, and doctors prefer to wait until the boundary between living and dead tissue is clear. But in the weeks and months that followed, surgeons cut away what the mountain had killed. These survivors lived. They returned to their families, their jobs, their ordinary lives. They would climb again, some of them, though perhaps never on Mount Rainier. They would carry the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. The psychological aftermath is harder to document, but no less real. Survivors' guilt. Nightmares. The persistent question, why did I live when they died? The memory of Patrick Nestler's last hours in the snow cave. The knowledge that John Craver was out there alone while they huddled in their shelters. These are wounds that do not heal with surgery. The guides who led the expedition faced their own reckonings. Sean Ryan had made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, and proved fatal in retrospect. He had chosen to continue climbing when turning back might have saved lives. He had chosen to shelter in place rather than risk more lives searching for John Craver. He had done what his training and experience told him to do. And it had not been enough. Whether he could have done more, whether anyone could have done more, is a question that has no definitive answer. The mountain does not issue verdicts. It only issues consequences. 𝗪𝗟𝗇𝗏, the founder of Alpine Ascents International, faced scrutiny of his company's protocols and decision-making processes. The disaster raised questions about commercial guiding on Rainier, about the pressures that push guides to continue when conditions are marginal, about the adequacy of emergency equipment requirements, about the gap between what forecasting can promise and what the mountain can deliver. These questions were not new in June of 1996. They had been asked after the 1981 ice avalanche that killed 11 climbers on the 𝗂𝗚𝗎𝗻 Glacier. They had been asked after other Rainier disasters, before and since. They would be asked again after the next tragedy and the next. Because the fundamental equation on Mount Rainier has not changed. The mountain still makes its own weather. The crevasses still hide beneath the snow. The gap between a successful summit day and a deadly one is still measured in hours of atmospheric cooperation. And commercial mountaineering still asks guides to interpret ambiguous conditions in real time, with paying clients behind them, knowing that the conservative call will disappoint people and the aggressive call might kill them. This is the architecture of risk on America's most iconic peak. It is a system that works most of the time. And when it fails absolutely. In the weeks and months following the June 1996 disaster, the National Park Service conducted a comprehensive review of what had happened on the upper Emmons Glacier. This was not a criminal investigation. No one was accused of wrongdoing. No one faced charges. The purpose of the review was different: to understand what had gone wrong, to identify systemic weaknesses, and to determine whether changes to policies and procedures could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The investigators reviewed everything. They examined the weather data, what forecasts had been available to the climbing party, what conditions had actually developed, and whether any warning signs had been missed or ignored. They examined the equipment, what the climbers had carried, what they should have carried, and whether the gap between the two had contributed to the deaths. They examined the decision-making, when the decision to climb had been made, when the decision to continue had been made, when the decision to shelter in place had been made, and whether any of these decisions had been unreasonable given the information available at the time. They interviewed survivors, guides, rangers, weather experts. They studied maps, photographs, and radio logs. They reconstructed the timeline of events hour by hour, decision by decision, from the moment the climbing party departed Camp Sherman until the moment the helicopter lifted the survivors off the mountain. What they found was not a story of recklessness or incompetence. It was a story of systems. Systems that worked most of the time, but were not designed to handle the worst-case scenario. Systems that created pressure, subtle, unspoken, but real, to continue rather than retreat. Systems that relied on weather forecasting technology that could not adequately predict Mount Rainier's localized storm development. Systems that equipped climbers for single-day summit pushes, but not for multi-day survival situations. The investigators concluded that no single decision had caused the disaster. Instead, a chain of individually reasonable decisions had accumulated into catastrophe. The weather forecast had not predicted a major storm. The guides had not ignored warning signs. The signs had been ambiguous, and experienced mountaineers can and do climb through ambiguous conditions. The decision to continue ascending at 13,000 feet had been a judgment call, and judgment calls are, by definition, uncertain. The real failure was not in any individual decision. The real failure was in the architecture of the system itself. The weather that struck Mount Rainier on June 11, 1996, was not unprecedented. It was not a once-in-a-century event, not a freak occurrence that no one could have anticipated. Storms of similar intensity had struck the mountain before and would strike again. What made June 11th deadly was not the storm itself, but the timing. A storm that materialized faster than anyone expected, lasting longer than anyone prepared for, catching a climbing party at the worst possible moment in the worst possible location. The post-disaster analysis revealed the atmospheric mechanics of what had happened. A Pacific weather system had moved inland during the night of June 10th and the morning of June 11th. This system carried significant moisture, water vapor that had evaporated from the ocean and was being pushed eastward by the prevailing winds. When this moist air encountered Mount Rainier, a 14,000-foot obstacle standing directly in its path, it was forced upward along the mountain's flanks. As the air rose, it cooled. As it cooled, the moisture condensed. Clouds formed. Precipitation began. This process, called orographic lifting, is the fundamental mechanism behind Mount Rainier's legendary snowfall and its capacity for rapid storm development. Other mountains experience orographic lifting, of course, but few mountains combine Rainier's height, isolation, and proximity to a moisture source like the Pacific Ocean. The lenticular cloud that formed over the summit on the morning of June 11th was the visible signature of this process. The cloud was not the storm. It was a symptom of atmospheric conditions that could produce a storm. Experienced mountaineers know to watch lenticular formations, but they also know that not every lenticular produces a storm at climbing altitude. On June 11th, this one did. The transition from forming lenticular to full whiteout blizzard occurred in approximately 2 hours. Fast enough that a climbing party at 13,000 feet had essentially no time to retreat to safety. The regional weather forecasts available in 1996 could not have predicted this rapid development with any precision. The forecasting models of that era lacked the resolution to simulate Rainier's localized effects. They could predict that a Pacific system was approaching. They could not predict that the system would interact with the mountain in a way that produced a multi-day blizzard at altitude, while conditions at lower elevations remained relatively mild. This was the gap that killed Patrick Nestler and John Craver. Not a gap between good forecasting and bad forecasting. A gap between what forecasting could do and what the mountain could do. The equipment analysis conducted after the disaster revealed a fundamental mismatch between what the climbing party carried and what they needed to survive. Standard equipment for a single-day summit push on Mount Rainier in 1996 included layered clothing, base layers, insulating layers, and a waterproof outer shell. This system was designed to manage moisture during exertion while providing protection from wind and precipitation. Crampons and ice axes for travel on snow and ice. Ropes and associated hardware for crevasse rescue. A day pack with food, water, and personal items. Emergency bivouac gear, lightweight bivy sacks, perhaps a thin emergency sleeping bag, a small stove with limited fuel for melting snow. This equipment was adequate for the conditions the climb was designed to encounter. A single day of climbing in weather that, if it deteriorated, would allow a reasonably rapid descent to Camp Sherman. It was not adequate for 40-plus hours of survival in a major blizzard at 13,800 feet. The gap was measured in degrees and hours. The climber's emergency sleeping bags might have been rated to 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The effective temperature in the snow caves, with wind chill factored in, was well below zero. The climbers' fuel supply might have been sufficient to melt snow for a few hours. They needed fuel for 2 days. The climbers' food supply might have been adequate for a long day of climbing. They needed calories for an extended survival situation in which their bodies were burning fuel just to generate enough heat to stay alive. The climbers' clothing was designed for exertion. Once they stopped moving, once the metabolic heat of climbing was replaced by the cold reality of waiting, the clothing's insulation was insufficient. No single piece of equipment was obviously inadequate. Each item was standard for the type of climb being attempted. But together, the system had no margin for error. It was calibrated precisely for success and had nothing in reserve for failure. This is the nature of single-day summit strategies on high peaks. They are efficient. They minimize the weight that climbers must carry. They maximize the chances of success in normal conditions. But they leave nothing in reserve for abnormal conditions. And Mount Rainier, on June 11, 1996, delivered conditions that were profoundly abnormal. The question raised by the equipment analysis was not whether the guides or the guiding company had done something wrong. They had followed standard practices. They had equipped their clients with standard gear. The question was whether standard practices were adequate for a mountain that periodically produces non-standard conditions. The answer clearly was no. If there is a single lesson to be drawn from the June 1996 disaster, it is this: catastrophes rarely result from a single dramatic mistake. They result from the accumulation of small decisions, each of which seems reasonable in isolation, none of which would be fatal on its own, but which together create a fragility that collapses when stress is applied. Consider the chain of decisions that led to the disaster. First, the decision to climb the Emmons Glacier route. This was not unreasonable. The Emmons is a classic route, well-established, well-documented. It is less crowded than the 𝗵𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀𝗃 route on the south side. For a commercial guiding company, offering the Emmons provides clients a more authentic mountaineering experience. But the Emmons is also the most remote of Rainier's major routes. Rescue teams cannot reach it quickly. It is exposed to Pacific weather with minimal protection. The distance between Camp Sherman and the summit zone is greater than on other routes, meaning more time spent in the danger zone. The decision to climb the Emmons was reasonable, but it had hidden costs. Second, the decision to accept the weather forecast as adequate for a summit attempt on June 11th. This was not unreasonable. The available forecasts did not predict a major storm. The conditions at Camp Sherman appeared acceptable. Guides had summited under similar-looking conditions many times before. But the forecast could not capture Rainier's capacity for explosive storm development. The mountain's volcanic topography and massive glacier system create localized weather that regional forecasts cannot predict with precision. The decision to trust the forecast was reasonable, but it was based on incomplete information presented as sufficient information. Third, the decision not to establish a firm, predetermined turnaround trigger before departing Camp Sherman. This was not unreasonable. Experienced guides typically make turnaround decisions dynamically, based on real-time assessment of conditions, party strength, and weather development. Rigid rules can sometimes force unnecessary retreat when conditions are actually fine. But without a predetermined trigger, the turnaround decision became subject to the psychological pressures of the moment. Proximity to the summit. Client expectations. The guide's own desire to succeed. The decision was made in the zone of ambiguity, where cognitive biases had room to operate. The decision to rely on dynamic judgment was reasonable, but it left the door open for optimism to override caution. Fourth, the decision to continue ascending above 13,000 feet as the lenticular cloud developed and wind increased. This was not unreasonable by standard mountaineering judgment. Lenticular clouds form frequently and do not always produce storms at climbing altitude. Conditions at the party's elevation, while worsening, were not yet at the level that would mandate retreat. But this was the point of no return. Above 13,000 feet on the Emmons, the party entered terrain where rapid descent through a whiteout was effectively impossible. By continuing, they committed to a course of action that required continued weather cooperation. The decision to continue was reasonable, but it wagered everything on cooperation that the mountain was about to revoke. Fifth, the decision to carry only emergency bivouac equipment rather than full overnight survival gear. This was not unreasonable. This is standard practice for single-day summit pushes. Carrying full camping gear would make the climb impossibly heavy and slow for clients. The entire guided climbing model is built on the assumption that parties will ascend and descend within a single weather window. But when the weather window collapsed, the emergency equipment became grossly inadequate. The gap between what they carried and what they needed was the gap that killed Patrick Nestler. The decision to go light was reasonable, but it left no margin for the unreasonable. Sixth, the inability to maintain contact with all party members during the onset of the whiteout. This was not unreasonable. Whiteout conditions can descend with such speed and totality that even roped teams can become disoriented. In the chaos of transitioning from climbing to emergency shelter mode, the primary focus was on getting the majority of the group into a defensible position. But John Craver died alone because of this separation. His death represents the most elemental danger of high-altitude whiteout, that the mountain can isolate you from other human beings so completely that you might as well be on another planet. The loss of contact was understandable, but it was fatal. Every one of these decisions was individually defensible. None was reckless. None was obviously wrong at the time it was made. The pattern is the architecture of commercial mountaineering itself, a system optimized for efficiency and success in normal conditions, with inadequate margins for conditions that fall outside the normal range. The pattern is confidence calibrated to the mountain's average behavior rather than its extreme behavior. The pattern is that the same professional competence and experience that enabled dozens of successful summits also created a decision-making framework that could not accommodate Rainier on its worst day. Mount Rainier occupies a unique position in the American imagination. It is one of the most recognizable mountains on Earth, a perfect volcanic cone rising above the Seattle skyline, visible from more than 100 miles away on clear days. It appears on license plates, on postcards, on the logos of outdoor companies and coffee roasters. Millions of people see it every day from their homes, their offices, their cars. This familiarity creates an illusion. The illusion is that Mount Rainier is known, understood, domesticated. After all, it is a national park. It has paved roads and visitor centers and gift shops selling postcards. It has rangers and permits and regulations. It has professional guiding companies and established routes and rescue helicopters on standby. All of this infrastructure suggests that the mountain has been tamed, that the risks have been identified, cataloged, and managed. That climbing Rainier is an adventure, certainly, but an adventure conducted within boundaries that modern technology and professional expertise have made safe. This is the illusion that killed Patrick Nestler and John Craver. Because Mount Rainier above 12,000 feet is not a national park in any meaningful sense. It is an Arctic environment perched atop an active volcano. The air is thin enough to impair judgment and physical function. The crevasses are deep enough to swallow a person without a trace. The weather is violent enough to kill in hours. The permits and the rangers and the guiding companies operate in this environment, but they do not control it. They can reduce risk, but they cannot eliminate it. They can improve the odds of survival, but they cannot guarantee survival. The gap between the mountain people think they are climbing and the mountain that actually exists is the gap that makes Rainier deadly. Climbers who approach Rainier expecting a well-managed adventure are unprepared for what happens when the mountain stops cooperating. And the mountain eventually always stops cooperating. Not every time, not most of the time, but often enough that over the decades, the bodies accumulate. More than 400 people have died on Mount Rainier since the first recorded climbing death in 1897. 400 people who expected to return home. 400 people whose families waited for them in vain. 400 people who learned, too late, that the mountain visible from the coffee shop window is not the mountain that exists above the clouds. Patrick Nestler and John Craver joined that number in June of 1996. They trusted the system. They trusted the guides. They trusted the mountain. And the mountain had no interest in honoring any of those trusts. There is a grim irony in the timing of the Mount Rainier disaster. 1 month earlier, on May 10th and 11th, 1996, a storm on Mount Everest had killed 8 climbers, including 2 of the world's most experienced high-altitude guides. The Everest disaster would become the defining mountaineering tragedy of the 20th century. Spawning books, documentaries, endless debate about the ethics of commercial guiding on the world's highest peaks. The central question of the Everest disaster was simple. Should mountains like Everest be commercialized at all? Is it possible to lead paying clients safely into the death zone, or does the commercial model create pressures that inevitably lead to catastrophe? The same questions applied to Mount Rainier. Rainier is not Everest, of course. It is less than half as high. It does not have a death zone in the technical sense, the altitude above which human physiology begins to fail regardless of acclimatization. It does not require months of preparation and hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is climbed by thousands of people every year, not a few hundred. But the structural similarities between the two disasters are striking. Both involved commercial guiding operations that had excellent safety records. Both involved guides who were experienced, professional, and respected in their field. Both involved weather that deteriorated faster than expected, trapping climbers at altitude with inadequate resources for extended survival. Both involved decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and proved fatal in retrospect. Both involved the fundamental tension between the commercial imperative to deliver a summit and the safety imperative to turn back when conditions deteriorate. The Everest disaster generated international headlines and years of soul-searching about the ethics of high-altitude guiding. The Rainier disaster generated regional headlines and a Park Service review that led to modest improvements in protocols and equipment requirements. Why the difference? Partly it was scale. 8 dead on Everest versus 2 dead on Rainier. The larger number commanded more attention. Partly it was exoticism. Everest is the highest point on Earth, a name that carries mythic weight. Rainier is a beautiful mountain, but it is also a familiar mountain, a regional landmark, not a global icon. Partly it was narrative. The Everest disaster had dramatic characters, rival expedition leaders, a journalist writing a book, a physician who would later write his own account. The Rainier disaster had ordinary people doing ordinary things on an ordinary-seeming mountain. But the underlying truth was the same. Commercial mountaineering, even on well-traveled peaks with professional guides and modern equipment, operates on margins that can disappear in hours. The system works most of the time. It fails some of the time. And when it fails, people die. This was true on Everest in May of 1996. It was true on Rainier in June of 1996. It remains true today. In the years following the June 1996 disaster, changes were implemented on Mount Rainier. The National Park Service revised its protocols for commercial guiding operations. Weather forecasting resources available to climbing rangers and guides were improved, not to the level that modern technology would later provide, but better than what had been available in June of '96. Emergency bivouac equipment requirements for guided parties were reviewed and strengthened. Rescue protocols were enhanced. Communication systems were upgraded. Training for climbing rangers was expanded to include more scenarios involving extended survival situations at altitude. The guiding companies adapted as well. 𝗹𝗶𝗃𝗃 International and other operators reviewed their decision-making frameworks, their equipment lists, their turnaround criteria. They incorporated the lessons of the disaster into their training programs, using June '96 as a case study in what can go wrong when the mountain delivers its worst. Guides who had not been on the mountain that day studied what had happened to their colleagues. They asked themselves, what would I have done differently? Would I have turned back at 13,000 feet? Would I have interpreted the lenticular cloud as a stop signal rather than a monitor signal? These questions had no easy answers. Because the truth, the uncomfortable, unsatisfying truth, is that the guides on June 11th had not done anything obviously wrong. They had made judgment calls in ambiguous conditions. Their judgment had been reasonable. It had also been fatal. The lesson was not that they had failed to follow the rules. The lesson was that the rules themselves were insufficient for the mountain's worst-case behavior. And so the rules were changed, made more conservative, more prescriptive, more oriented toward retreat than advance. But rules can only do so much. Ultimately, mountaineering remains an activity that depends on human judgment exercised in real time, with imperfect information, in an environment that punishes mistakes without appeal. No rule can eliminate the moment when a guide must look at a forming, lenticular cloud and decide, do we go up or do we go down? No rule can eliminate the pressure, however subtle, however unspoken, that comes from clients who have paid and trained and traveled for this opportunity. No rule can eliminate the mountain. For the families of Patrick Nestler and John Craver, the institutional changes offered little comfort. Their loved ones were gone. No amount of improved forecasting or revised equipment requirements could bring them back. No lessons learned, no protocols enhanced, no training updated could undo what the mountain had done. What the families were left with was absence. The empty chair at the holiday table. The photographs that would never be updated. The phone calls that would never come. The gradual fading of a voice from memory. The blurring of a face over time. And questions. Why them? Why that day? Why didn't they turn back? These questions have no satisfying answers. The families could study the timeline, read the reports, interview the survivors, and still not understand, not in any way that brought closure, why Patrick and John died while others lived. The difference between the dead and the living on Mount Rainier that week was measured in small things. A few more degrees of insulation. A slightly more efficient metabolism. A position in the snow cave that was marginally warmer. A decision to stay with the group rather than drift away in the whiteout. These are not meaningful distinctions. They are not moral distinctions. They are simply the arbitrary factors that determined who walked off the mountain and who did not. For the families of the dead, this arbitrariness is perhaps the hardest thing to accept. There was no reason. There was no justice. There was only the mountain, indifferent to human plans and human suffering, delivering consequences without explanation. Patrick Nestler was 34 years old. He had dreams and plans and people who loved him. He died shivering in a hole in the ice because a weather system interacted with a volcanic cone in a way that no one could have predicted. John Craver was a determined, independent-minded man. He died alone on a glacier because visibility dropped to zero, and he could not find his way back to people who were trying to save him. Their families live with this knowledge. And the mountain, unchanged by their deaths, continues to rise above the Seattle skyline, beautiful and indifferent, waiting for the next group of climbers who believe that this time, things will be different. Mount Rainier today is both different and the same. The technology has improved dramatically since 1996. Weather forecasting models have become more sophisticated, more capable of simulating the localized effects that volcanic peaks produce. Satellite imagery is available in real time. Climbers carry GPS devices and satellite communicators that can summon rescue from almost anywhere on the mountain. Communication has improved as well. Guides can check forecasts from high camp, receive updates during the climb, and make decisions based on information that would have been unavailable to their counterparts in '96. Rescue capabilities have improved. Helicopter technology has advanced, allowing higher altitude operations with greater margins of safety. Rescue protocols have been refined through decades of practice. Climbing rangers are better trained, better equipped, better supported. And yet, Mount Rainier still makes its own weather. The lenticular clouds still form over the summit, and they still cannot be predicted with perfect reliability. Storms still materialize in hours, catching climbers who thought they had a window. The crevasses still hide beneath the snow. The whiteouts still descend without warning. The cold still penetrates clothing and flesh and bone. And the commercial guiding model still operates on margins that can disappear when the mountain stops cooperating. Thousands of people attempt Mount Rainier every year. The majority succeed. The majority return safely. The disaster of June 1996 is not repeated every season. It is not even repeated every decade. But people still die on Mount Rainier. Not every year, but most years. A crevasse fall here, an avalanche there, a sudden storm, a medical emergency, a simple slip on steep ice. The mountain does not discriminate. It does not care whether its victims are experienced or inexperienced, guided or independent, well-equipped or poorly equipped. It simply delivers consequences to those who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Patrick Nestler and John Craver were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They did not know it until it was too late. Neither will the next victims. Because Mount Rainier is not a mountain that has been tamed. It is a mountain that tolerates human presence most of the time. And when it stops tolerating, the tolerance ends without appeal. Imagine yourself in the position of the lead guide on the morning of June 11th, 1996. You are standing at approximately 13,000 feet on the Emmons Glacier. Behind you are 10 clients, people who have paid hundreds of dollars, trained for months, and traveled across the country for this opportunity. They are tired from the pre-dawn ascent, but they are determined. They want to reach the summit. That is what they came for. That is what they hired you to help them do. Above you, a lenticular cloud is forming over the summit. You know what lenticular clouds can mean. You have seen them before, hundreds of times probably. Most of the time, they dissipate without incident. Sometimes they produce storms at altitude while conditions at lower elevations remain fine. Occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, they explode into the kind of whiteout blizzard that traps climbers and kills them. You cannot know at this moment which scenario will unfold. The wind is picking up. The sky has a milky quality that suggests high-altitude moisture. These are warning signs, but they are ambiguous warning signs. You have climbed through conditions like this before and summited without incident. You look at the summit, tantalizingly close, maybe 3 hours of climbing, maybe less for a fit party. You look at the cloud, still developing, not yet producing storm conditions at your elevation. You look at your clients, waiting for your decision, trusting you to make the right call. What do? If you turn back now and the storm never materializes, you have aborted a summit attempt unnecessarily. Your clients will be disappointed. Some may be angry. They paid for a summit, and you denied them that summit based on clouds that turned out to be harmless. Your company will record a non-summit. Your success rate will decline slightly. Other potential clients, comparing guiding companies, may choose one with a higher success rate. And you will spend the rest of the day second-guessing yourself. Was I too cautious? Did I deny these people an experience they deserved because I was afraid of clouds? If you continue and the weather holds, you will lead your clients to the summit of Mount Rainier. They will stand at 14,411 feet, looking out over the Pacific Northwest, feeling the satisfaction of having achieved something difficult and meaningful. Your company will record a summit. Your reputation as a guide who delivers results will be enhanced. Your clients will go home with photographs and memories and stories to tell. If you continue and the weather does not hold, if the lenticular explodes into a whiteout blizzard while you are on the exposed upper glacier with no shelter and no way down, then everything changes. Then you are fighting for survival with equipment designed for a day climb, not an extended bivouac. Then you are watching your clients deteriorate, knowing that you cannot help them, knowing that the decision you made hours ago is the reason they are dying. Then you are living with the consequences for the rest of your life. This is the choice the guide faced on June 11th. He chose to continue. Was he wrong? Here is the question I want you to consider. If you were the lead guide on that morning, standing at 13,000 feet with a forming lenticular cloud above and 10 clients behind you who have paid and trained for this moment, would you have turned back? Think carefully before you answer. It is easy from the safety of the present, knowing how the story ends, to say, of course I would have turned back. The warning signs were there. The lenticular was forming. The wind was increasing. Any responsible guide would have retreated. But you did not have the benefit of hindsight on the morning of June 11th. You did not know that the lenticular would produce a multi-day blizzard. You did not know that the storm would trap your party for 40 hours. You did not know that 2 people would die. You knew only what you could see: a cloud forming, wind increasing, conditions worsening but not yet dangerous. And you knew something else, that if you turned back and the storm never came, you would have denied your clients the summit for nothing. How many times would you make that call? How many summit mornings with ambiguous weather would you cancel before your clients and your company lost faith in your judgment? 1, 2, 10. At what point does prudence become paralysis? At what point does caution become cowardice? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that every mountain guide must answer, not once but repeatedly, every time the weather is uncertain and the summit is within reach. There is no formula that resolves them. No algorithm that tells you when to continue and when to retreat. No rule that eliminates the uncertainty. There is only judgment. And judgment, on a mountain that does not forgive mistakes, is a heavy burden to carry. The deeper question is whether the system of commercial mountaineering on peaks like Rainier can ever be made safe. Not safer. The system has become safer since 1996. Better forecasting, better equipment, better protocols, better rescue capabilities. But safe, truly safe. Safe in the sense that parents feel safe putting their children on an airplane, knowing that the statistical odds of disaster are vanishingly small. The answer almost certainly is no. Commercial mountaineering operates in environments that humans do not control and cannot fully predict. Weather systems develop in ways that defy modeling. Crevasses hide beneath surfaces that appear solid. Altitude impairs judgment at precisely the moment when good judgment is most critical. And the commercial model itself, the need to attract clients, to maintain success rates, to deliver the experience that people have paid for, creates pressures that push toward the margins of acceptable risk. These pressures are not the result of greed or recklessness. They are inherent in the structure of the enterprise. A guiding company that never summits will have no clients. A guide who always turns back will have no reputation. A mountain that is never climbed will generate no revenue. The system requires that risks be taken. The only question is how much risk and who decides. On June 11, 1996, the decision was made to accept a level of risk that proved fatal. But here is the uncomfortable truth. That same decision had been made hundreds of times before, and the outcome had been fine. The storm that killed Patrick Nestler and John Craver was not inevitable. It was probabilistic. On most days, in most conditions, the decision to continue climbing would have led to a successful summit and a safe descent. June 11th was not most days, and the system has no way of knowing in advance which day will be the exception. This is the irreducible risk of mountaineering on high peaks. It can be managed. It can be minimized. It cannot be eliminated. And those who venture into the mountains, guided or independent, experienced or novice, must accept this truth or stay home. Patrick Nestler and John Craver accepted the risk. They did not expect to pay the price. Neither does anyone else. Until they do. Mount Rainier stands today exactly as it stood on June 11, 1996. The Emmons Glacier still flows from near the summit, its crevasses opening and closing with the seasons, its surface reshaping itself year by year as the ice moves slowly downhill. The summit crater still vents warm steam from the volcano's interior. The lenticular clouds still form when moist Pacific air encounters the mountain's massive bulk. Camp Sherman still perches on Steamboat Prow, a tiny human outpost in a vast wilderness of ice and rock. Climbing rangers still staff the station during the summer season, monitoring conditions, offering guidance, preparing for rescues that they hope will never be necessary. The route that the Alpine Ascents Party followed on June 11th is still climbed every season by hundreds of people. They ascend in the pre-dawn darkness, their headlamps bobbing like fireflies on the glacier. They summit on clear days, photographing the views, celebrating their achievements. They descend, tired but triumphant, to Camp Sherman and then to the trailhead and then to their ordinary lives. Most of them return safely. Some of them do not. The mountain does not count its victims. It does not keep score. It does not remember Patrick Nestler or John Craver or any of the other 400 people who have died on its slopes. It simply exists. Beautiful, indifferent, eternal, rising above the Seattle skyline like a promise and a warning. Visible from a million windows. known to millions of people who have never set foot on its glaciers, and utterly, absolutely unconcerned with human plans, human ambitions, human lives. In 2014, Mount Rainier National Park installed a memorial honoring all climbers and rangers who have lost their lives on the mountain. The memorial does not list names. The list would be too long, the losses too numerous. It speaks instead of courage and sacrifice, of dreams pursued and lives given. It stands near the Paradise Visitor Center, the most popular destination in the park, where millions of visitors come each year to admire the mountain from a safe distance. Most of these visitors will never climb higher than the trails around Paradise. They will photograph the wildflowers in summer, the snow in winter. They will buy postcards and magnets and t-shirts. They will return to their cars and their hotels and their ordinary lives, having experienced Mount Rainier as a beautiful backdrop to a pleasant day out. They will not think about Patrick Nestler or John Craver. They will not know what happened on June 11th, 1996. They will not understand, not really, not viscerally, what the mountain is capable of when the weather turns and the rescue helicopters cannot fly and the cold begins its patient work on human flesh. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the mountain's beauty is worth the price that some have paid to witness it up close. Perhaps the dreams of standing on the summit are worth the risk of never returning. Perhaps. But the memorial stands as a reminder that the price has been paid over and over again by people who thought they were prepared, who thought the system would protect them, who thought they would be among the majority who return. And were not. The storm that struck Mount Rainier on June 11, 1996, lasted approximately 40 hours. When it ended, 2 people were dead, several more were maimed for life, and the illusion that commercial mountaineering on America's most iconic peak was fundamentally safe had been shattered. The illusion has been rebuilt, of course. Thousands of people climb Rainier every year, trusting the guides, trusting the forecasts, trusting the system. Most of them return safely. The disaster of 1996 fades into history, remembered by the survivors and the families of the dead, forgotten by almost everyone else. But the mountain has not changed. It still makes its own weather. It still hides its crevasses. It still punishes those who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it still waits, patient and indifferent, for the next storm, the next decision, the next disaster. Patrick Nestler was 34 years old when he died. He was 600 feet from the summit he had trained and paid and dreamed of reaching. John Craver died alone on the ice, separated from his companions by a few hundred feet of whiteout that might as well have been 1,000 miles. They trusted the system. The system failed them. And the mountain, which cannot be blamed because it cannot be reasoned with, continues to rise above the Pacific Northwest, beautiful and deadly, tolerating human presence until it doesn't. This is the story of the 1996 Mount Rainier disaster. It is not a story with heroes or villains. It is a story about the gap between what we think we control and what we actually control. It is a story about ordinary people who walked into an extraordinary situation and did not all walk out. And it is a story that will, inevitably, be repeated, not in its exact details, but in its essential shape, as long as humans continue to venture into places where the margin between life and death is measured in hours of weather and degrees of temperature. The mountain endures. The mountain does not care. The mountain simply is. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I know it was a long journey, through the history of the mountain, through the decisions that led to disaster, through the snow caves and the cold and the deaths of 2 people who deserved to come home. If you are still listening, it means something about this story resonated with you. Maybe you are a climber yourself, and you recognize the dilemmas that faced the guides on June 11th. Maybe you have never set foot on a mountain, but you understand the human impulse to test ourselves against challenges that might defeat us. Maybe you simply wanted to know how the story ended. Whatever brought you here, I have a question for you. It is the question that has haunted me throughout the research and writing of this script. If you were the lead guide on the morning of June 11th, 1996, standing at 13,000 feet with a forming lenticular cloud above and 10 clients behind you who have paid and trained for this moment, would you have turned back? Not knowing how the story ends. Not knowing that the storm would trap you for 40 hours. Not knowing that 2 people would die. Just you and the cloud and the decision. Would you have turned back? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one, and I am genuinely curious what you would have done. Because there is no right answer. There is only the answer you would have lived with or died with on June 11th, 1996. If this story stayed with you, I want to tell you about what is coming next. In the next video on this channel, I am covering a disaster that is, in some ways, even more heartbreaking than what happened on Mount Rainier. It is the story of the 1986 Mount Hood disaster, the climbing accident that killed 9 people, including 7 high school students from the Oregon Episcopal School in Portland. Like the Rainier disaster, it involved a guided group on a cascade volcano. Like Rainier, it involved a sudden storm that trapped climbers at altitude. Like Rainier, it involved decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and proved fatal in retrospect. But the Mount Hood disaster had one element that makes it almost unbearable to contemplate. The victims were children, teenagers, students on a school climbing trip, kids whose parents had signed permission slips, trusting that the adults in charge would keep them safe. And here is one detail that will stay with you. The Oregon Episcopal School climb was considered so routine that the supervising adults did not carry a radio. In 1986, on a mountain that would kill 7 of their students within hours. If you want to hear that story, and I warn you, it is not easy listening, subscribe to this channel. The video will be coming soon. If you are new here and you are interested in stories like this one, mountain disasters, expedition tragedies, the tales of those who ventured into extreme environments and did not return, this is what this channel is about. We tell these stories with respect and historical rigor. We do not sensationalize. We do not exploit. We simply try to understand what happened, why it happened, and what it means for those of us who were not there. Subscribe if you want to hear more. And until next time, stay safe. The mountains will be there when you are ready for them. They will be there long after you are gone. They do not care about our schedules or our ambitions. They simply endure.